Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
More than 25 years ago, the late Professor Paul Borghi developed an interview series which he called Reflections in Time. It was intended to preserve some of the history of the University of Nebraska at Omaha by recording experiences of people who had contributed to its development. With the aid of the UNO Alumni Association, I've continued Paul's work with this series. My name is Jack Newton. Although I'm retired, I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960 and served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Borghi and I worked closely in developing his original series, and I continue it today as a tribute to him. We have as our guest today in the studio Professor Richard Duggin in the Writer's Workshop here at UNO. Welcome, Richard. It's good to have you with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I usually mention that it's the year is 2007, and this is a rainy spring day in March of that year.
A very pleasant rainy spring day, actually. We need the moisture. So.
Right. But it really is good to have you with us, and I look forward to learning something about the Writer's Workshop, which is a very interesting component of the university here, and one that I don't think a lot of people know much about. So we'll learn about it today and learn about your development of it, because you were the originator, I think, of the whole project.
Right.
Well, you joined the faculty, I think, originally in the English department. That's when I first knew you, right?
That's correct. I came in 1964, September of '64, and was in the English department for 10 years before we established as a separate program the UNO Writers Workshop, which at that time as well moved out of English as a sub-program in English and into what at that time was the nascent College of Fine Arts.
Yeah, began. That was just that started in what, 72 or 73?
70. So. Yeah, well, it would have been when. Officially, it was started when Ronald Roskins came on as the first permanent chancellor of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and it was.
So you kind of grew up with the college then.
That's correct. That's correct.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about you, because I've known you for a long, long time.
That has been.
But I've never asked you a whole lot about your background, so let's go back to your roots. Where do you come from? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school?
Originally, I was born and I guess partially raised in Massachusetts, Wellesley, Massachusetts. Actually born in Boston, but Wellesley's about 10 miles away from there. So Wellesley was my formative years, I guess. Grade school, junior high school, and my first year of high school, and then
you don't talk like you came from Boston.
No, well, you have to talk to my wife. She catches it every now and again. And it's not so much Boston as broader New England, sort of. Yeah, she makes fun of me of my A's and my aunts and my the sort of thing, orange. And in any event, the family moved to a small town in New Hampshire, Wilton, New Hampshire, when my parents purchased, at that time it was a 150-year-old colonial what used to be an inn that sat on 150 acres of woodland and a mile away from the nearest neighbor, and it was their retreat. My father was a traveling salesman and liked to get, when he came off the road, liked to be, you know, more reclusive, I think, and regenerate. So we moved there to Wilton, and I finished up high school in the small town of Wilton High. In fact, our 50th anniversary now of graduation anniversaries coming up this September, in a class of what that time was 33, was the largest class that the Wilton High School had enjoyed. And then from there, I went to the University of New Hampshire, where I did my undergraduate work in English literature and creative writing, because I had had an interest in writing ever since I was 8, 9 years old.
How did that develop?
It developed because I guess my imagination is such that I see things in terms of stories. I read at an early age and was taken with narrative types of stories. At that time, during my younger years, just after World War II, I'd gotten hold of and was reading the war journals of Ernie Pyle, actually the dispatches of Pyle during the war that have been collected into books, and his stories of human, you know, conflict were so striking to me that I you know, fell in love with that. Plus, my mother was one of those who read to us as children every night. And it was somehow part of hearing her voice telling these stories to us. And interestingly enough, perhaps too personally enough, but she used to, while she read, would scratch my back. And it was like, as I look back on it now, that pleasant sensation of physical sensation on my nervous system with her words and the language of the stories was like it was like her fingers, as though her fingers were a recording needle, sort of indelibly putting into my nervous system all of the pleasant sounds of language. So I think it's just, you know, I sort of romantically kind of
now you said us. Did you come from a large family?
Not a large family. There were 3 of us. I have a older brother and a younger sister, and it was my younger sister and I, who are 3 years apart, who kind of grew up together. So it was us. But also during that time, I spent 2 years. I was out of school for 2 years because of illness. And in that time, I had a lot of, you know, leisure, bedridden to, you know, to have to entertain myself. And so it started to come out in terms of writing stories. My parents got me a little portable typewriter, and I started to do the newspaper for the neighborhood. The news of the neighborhood. Well, I didn't know what was going on in the neighborhood, so I had to invent, you know, stories about my neighbors, and I guess that's where
I won't make any comment about newspaper.
No, right, but I probably at the, you know, so it was sort of a gossip, you know, gossip paper where the gossip had no foundation at all, and pretty much what was happening, except for what I could overhear from my parents downstairs as they would talk about the day's events in the neighborhood. But I always knew, I think from a very early age, that writing along with reading was what I was, you know, was what I wanted to do with my life. And so when I went to the University of New Hampshire, there was a novelist there, Thomas Williams, who I consider probably my first mentor. And it was his influence on me that moved me from seeing writing as a commercial venture, that is, to writing adventure stories or fantabulous kinds of stories that came primarily out of imagination and no experience, to doing it the other way around, to seeing that the best stories are the ones that you know, that bring us as human beings back into the kinds of lives we live. So it was that undergraduate experience, I think, that then led me on to go do graduate work in writing at the...
Well, speaking of graduate work, now I know that you ended up in Iowa, and but that's a long way from New England. How did you happen to come out here?
Well, Iowa and Stanford universities at the time were the places to study on a graduate level creative writing. The Iowa Writers Workshop, which is the sort of grandparent for all of the writing programs in the country,
and
anywhere else.
World famous.
Right, at that time was still run by Paul Engel, who began that program in 1953, and my mentor from New Hampshire was a graduate of that program. So he was the one that said, if you want to continue to learn this is what you ought to do, and by recommendation and by samples of my work that I had to submit to get in, I ended up taking. At that time, I was married, had one child, and another one on the way. And when we left to go to Iowa, when we hit Buffalo, New York on the interstate, commented to my wife at the time, every revolution of the wheel was farther west than we'd ever been in our lives. And so
I know the feeling.
yeah,
I did the same thing.
And it was, it was sort of an intimidating experience because Iowa had a good reputation at that time for its academics, still does. It was a far bigger university than the undergraduate one I went to. So when we arrived in Iowa, I spent a lot of time just trying to figure, am I going to survive here? Which was soon dispelled once I got really involved in the classes and the workshops there.
Well, it must, in such a well-known program, that must have they must have had a lot of applicants. Was it difficult to get accepted there?
Quite frankly, I don't know. Those sorts of statistics weren't a part of. I do know that when I applied there, and I applied to Stanford University, and I was accepted in both places. And probably the primary decision to go to Iowa as opposed to Stanford is Stanford wanted $1,000 a semester for tuition. University of Iowa wanted $300 for the year for tuition, which is nowhere.
They both seem so
and that was
tiny
$300 for up to 15 hours of credit. I mean, they didn't do it by the credit hour; they did it by the course. So that made that decision a little easier for me. But also the reputation of Iowa sent me there, and I don't know how competitive it was. I just knew it was competitive. Now I hear statistics that are huge. They get thousands of applications to fill 25 spots in each of their major genres each year. So, and that's the way it is around the country pretty much for resident grad programs.
And you graduated then with a Master of Fine Arts.
That's correct.
And,
right. Which was a 60-hour degree at that time, not a 30 or 36-hour degree, and was considered, still is, basically, in terms of creative writing, a terminal degree. There is no real PhD in writing, though one can get a PhD with a creative dissertation in certain places now. So, yeah, it was a full 2-year program, if not longer, but I had basically only 2 years that I could spend there because I had a family to think about. And so I was taking 15 credit hours, graduate credit hours a semester to get through and get my 60 hours taken care of.
Graduate hours, that's tough.
That was tough because that included literature courses on the graduate level. It included another course in an allied art that we had to take as part of the program, and so forth. So I didn't have much time to sit and enjoy the whole ambiance of being at Iowa, and or to form much of a community with my peers, other students there, because I had to spend most of my time, going from class back home, working on my writing, doing my other classwork, and then going back to class, as opposed to congregating down at the local caravansary, as it were, of an evening, and with students who had planned not to graduate in 2 years. They already figured they would be there for 3 years. So,
well, then you got your degree and you left there, and what did you do next?
Well, I got a job back east again at a small state university in New York, 2-year college in Cobleskill. And spent a year there before applying for and getting a job at Omaha University in the English department. And the way that came about, one of the people I did meet and got to know well at University of Iowa was a student in the art department whose name was Tom Majeski, who may be familiar with you.
Yeah, and you collaborated with him later. You did some illustrations for one of your book.
Yes. And so Tom was coming back to Omaha. He had a job to teach art here at OU at that time, but we maintained communication. And my job teaching at this small school in New York was basically teaching composition in an English department, 12 hours of that kind of thing, which was far from what, you know, with the fire in my belly as a creative writer coming out of Iowa. I wanted to be able to teach something in my discipline, and there was no opportunity to do that. So he said, why don't you come on? He called me one time and said, how are you doing? I said, I'm not doing too well. I'm not particularly happy here. He said, well, there's an opening in the English department here. Why don't you apply for it? So I did. And in those days, under Milo Bale and the budget the way it was and his way of maintaining control, I was literally hired by mail because they didn't want to pay to have me come out for an interview. They couldn't.
Well, you had Tom's endorsement.
Well, I had Tom's endorsement, but I also, on my own, then paid to come out for my own interview because I, said to myself, I'm not going to go any place that's going to accept me sight unseen. I want to know what I'm getting into. So I did pay for my own. I came out and stayed with Tom and went through the interview process and decided, this would be a great job because they had an opportunity here to teach a course with a creative turn to it, a thing called narrative writing, which at that time was being taught by Marion Marsh Brown, the only other writer on the staff besides part-time Carl Jones.
Very well-known writer.
A very well-known writer. And she was getting ready to retire, and she had no problem saying, well, let him teach this course to bring him in. And it was that course that became the nucleus for additional things, an interest growing in creative writing track here, which was part of, I think, what I always felt I wanted to do if I were going to go into university teaching. In my undergraduate years, I was able to take, because that's all they offered, 3 courses, 3 semesters in writing, and I wanted more. I was hungry for it, but there wasn't the opportunity. And then at Iowa, the work was so intensely focused with students coming from all over the country who had varying degrees of experience writing, that it just generated and stimulated my mind and creativity to the point that I thought, if I ever had the opportunity, in college to teach, I would like to offer the same kind of stimulus that a graduate degree offers, but on an undergraduate level. Because I thought, the years that I spent, the 4 years, I knew I wanted to write. I knew I needed more training, but I considered my undergraduate years, because of the poverty of courses I could take, the dearth of courses, to be sort of fallow years in my development as a writer. So that my idea was that if it was ever possible, it would be great to be able to build a course, and that's where the germ of the idea for the creative writing program came.
The university back then was Municipal University of Omaha.
Just
this was before we
came
a state university.
Right. That's right.
And you mentioned Milo Bale was the president, and then he had the title president back then.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about what the campus was like back in those days.
I want to say quaint. But that's, but it wasn't. It was. I mean, obviously, it was more. It was the largest campus I'd ever been on, because even the State University at New York campus was in Cobleskill was confined to a very small geographical or physical area, topographical area. It sat on a hill in Cobleskill, and it had about as many buildings, I guess, but on a smaller scale. The total population there was 2,500 students. And I came here at that time, and we were 9,000 to 10,000 students, that as a municipal university. But in terms of buildings, we had, I'm trying to remember, there was the administration building, which is now Arts and Sciences Hall. There was the library, which is now the Epley building, the administration building. The student center, I think, had recently been built. The building that we are in currently was the engineering building. Now it's not even that; it's gutted.
Right.
I mean, here we are.
It will become College of
Public
Affairs and Community Service.
Yeah. So beyond this room, I guess I don't know what's going on up there, except everything's been torn out and is being. I guess it's being expanded. But there was this building. There was the field house. And I'm trying to think. I think I was here when Allwine Hall went up, and then
That's
you know,
68,
and then each building thereafter. So there were.
Well, there was the Sarah Jocelyn Music Annex, and that was a temporary building.
Yeah.
And,
Well, the temporaries that were.
and of course, we had some smaller temporaries
Right.
over there behind the administration.
That was one of the highlights in my career in the English department is when they put the blue buildings up. They set some as well over on the west part of campus where the new music building, the Strauss building, is now. That was and it was a parking
for a
lot.
number of years we
And
had
I
those,
got to be able to office over there, and these new little things with faux paneling,
Right.
you know, on the rest of it, and away from the kind of cubicles
they were in
we
the
were
parking
working
lot.
in.
They put them up in the parking
Yep,
lot.
they did. And I had my own office as
Right.
opposed to the kind of cubicles we worked in over there in the administration building. I thought that was pretty hot.
They were fine when they were new, but
Yeah,
boy,
oh,
they
no.
got kind of
very,
moldy.
very quickly. But I remember at the time, you know, the chair of the English department coming and saying, there are these buildings being built for offices. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer to go over there? And, you know, a lot of people shook their heads and said, no, I won't go. What do I want to do that for? And I said, yeah, I do. You know? And as a matter of fact, several others then went along with us. Richard Lane, Dick Lane, who was in the, he came over in office there, and one or two others. And so we had basically one of those buildings as the English Department Annex West.
Well, eventually those were torn down, or not torn down, moved away actually, and the university got a little money back on them, and I'm not sure, but I think I heard somebody say that they sold them over in Iowa to somebody who had a hog farm, and they used them to raise pigs.
Somehow that seemed appropriate to me. I don't, probably they wouldn't have had to do much conversion.
I don't know whether that's apocryphal or not, but it makes a good story.
It does.
What you were teaching then in the English department courses that you enjoyed teaching, and that's great.
Yes. Well, I had my complement of composition courses, which were good courses, but not so many that they would overwhelm us with the kind of sameness that sort of work can provide. Plus teaching generalist courses like short story, like the short story literature courses, and then this narrative writing course that I was able, because of student interest, to build into another semester and another semester of fiction. And the writer's workshop itself, I began talking to my colleagues in English and to Ralph Wardle at the time, who was chair, about the potential for creating a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in creative writing within the English department. And
at that time it would have been possible because all of the arts programs were
the arts
in
were
the
still
Arts
in
and Science College.
they were still in the Arts and Science
There
College.
was no College of Fine Arts yet.
And but budget and goals being what they were at that time, you know, Dr. Wardle pointed out, we can't build a separate program. We don't have the resources to do so. In fact, it came down to at one point as the popularity of creative writing courses and my teaching them became evident. Dr. Wardle at one point said, when I said, you know, we could build this into a BFA program, he said, Richard, we can't have people majoring in Duggin. And I said, well, that's quite true, so hire me a poet. and you know, at that point he said, we don't need a poet at this point. We need, you know, a medievalist. We need, you know, whatever, another facts. So it's sort of, you know, we hit that point of the need for a program to develop, to build and expand at the same time that you know, the department was working at the limits of its capabilities in terms of budget and so forth. But that was also coincidentally the same time when there was a movement discussion within the arts and sciences among people in music, theater, and art to establish a school of fine arts, because they as well felt that within the larger pecking order of the college, their needs were not being necessarily addressed for their own development, and they thought perhaps if we had a school, you know, of the arts, that we might stand a better chance. So, and I don't remember exactly who, but at that time they began to build a prospectus for what that kind of school would look like, and they came to me someone came to me, and I'm not sure who it was. It might have been Tom Majeski, but said, you know, you're a writer. Give us a hand with wording this thing. And I said, well, I'd be happy to do that with the proviso that you consider creative writing an art, which I consider it. What are the arts? And that it becomes a program within the school if it's passed. And I sort of scratched it. Well, I guess sounds awfully odd, but yeah, that's fine. Why not? So I helped write that and edit that proposal, including then the concept of a program in creative writing that would lead to a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. And that was accepted, and the school was established about the time then that the change came. We had already become officially, I guess, the University of Nebraska at Omaha.
1968.
Under an interim chancellor. Then they hired Ronald Roskins to be the first permanent chancellor of the university, and I'm sure he came in looking for something to put an immediate imprimatur on.
Well, he always had an interest in the arts.
And he did have a very distinct interest in the arts, in fact. So he saw that proposal, and he brought people in to talk about it. He brought me in to talk about the creative writing thing, because he was familiar with the writer's workshop there at Iowa.
Yeah, he was from Iowa.
Exactly, and with what Paul Engel had done over there, and so we discussed that, and I think it was with a short time afterwards that he brought that whole thing to the Regents to turn it into a college of fine arts. So we went from being, you know, I went from being actually the smallest program in the institution to the smallest program in the smallest college in the institution. And I think we had, at that time, I was able to hire a half-time person in poetry, and you know, we built from there. Our program.
So you were really at the very start of this whole program.
Yes.
And the founder of it, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I really enjoyed hearing you talk about Ralph Wardle. He was a good friend,
man.
and you
wonderful.
Sounded. I could just hear him saying the things that you mentioned. He was a great person.
He was.
And he was a writer himself.
Yes, yes.
You know,
he did a number of scholarly and biographical works on literary figures. Mary Wollstonecraft, particularly, was one of his specialties. That did in the scholarly world did quite well. I mean, you know, were quite respected. He to me is what epitomized what I call the old school of you know, professorship. He was a Harvard-educated man, so we had that you know, that East Coast connection, and he addressed things in just that way. Always, it was a pleasure to listen to him speak. He was so articulate about you know, in his use of language, and succinct. And
well, I'd like to go on and talk a little bit more about how the Writers' Workshop grew and so on. But first of all, I'd like to mention that that in the process of all of this teaching that you enjoyed doing, you were twice awarded the highest award that the university gives for teachers, the Excellence in Teaching, or it's had different names over the years, the Great Teacher Award or whatever. But you won it twice. And,
well, I won. There were two awards. The Alumni Association had its.
I was thinking of that.
That's right.
I
won.
That's right.
I was awarded that, and then a year later or so, I received the university's Excellence in Teaching Award.
So that's great. And, your efforts were rewarded that way, but I'm sure that they were rewarded more especially by the students that you worked with.
That's what's made it all worth it. And which is interesting, because I never thought I wanted to teach. I just didn't know what else I would do once I left Iowa.
Let's talk a little bit about how the Writers' Workshop grew. Oh, let me ask you one question that's bothered me. And as a person who's, if I remember correctly, kind of a stickler for language, maybe you can help me understand what the right answer is. As I looked at that Writers' Workshop, and I've looked at it in different catalogs and other places, it's spelled 3 different ways.
Well,
It's either
ours is,
writers with no apostrophe,
right.
writer apostrophe S, or writers apostrophe.
The University of Iowa, which was the first program, uses no apostrophe. It's just writers plural. For our program should always have been writers with an apostrophe. That is, assuming that
Plural and
singular apostrophe. Yes, this is the writers, a writers workshop. Right. So that's how I named it, and whether typographically it's been changed, because of other people taking it and putting it into print, but regarding ours. But there are also other programs that use writers plural with an apostrophe. So I guess it just depends on the sensibility of the person.
Depends on the approach you take to it.
Right, at the time that they're given the name.
Okay, well that solves that problem.
Yeah, it does get to be confusing, or can be. So that's how.
How did it grow?
Well, by fits and starts, almost as an underground movement. When we first moved into the College of Fine Arts, when we first began the program with 1.5 faculty members, I began looking for a place as well, so that it wasn't just the name and that students met in classrooms. I needed a place that created the kind of ambiance that said to students, to people coming into the program, this is a community of writers. So at that time, there were a number of houses to the west of the campus that were being subsumed by the university. One of which was one of the milder homes, and behind that home was a carriage house. Carriage house sat where currently the library and the Durham Science. It sat really between what would be now the space between the Durham Science Center and the library, and so they ultimately tore it down. It was a 7-room carriage house, and I remember lobbying with Ronald Roskins. This is the place for us to have a program, and we were given that building. 7 rooms. We used bedrooms for offices. We used the big long living room for classrooms, and another upstairs large room to do work on publication, that was a student publication we were using, and so forth. And so it was a home where people came. The classes began were offered largely in the evenings. So we brought in people from the community. In fact, its first name was called the UNO Communities-Writers Workshop. Community Writers Workshop, and a lot of our first students into the program were people who had already, established careers, were coming back to school because of an interest in writing, and classes ran in the evening. We did that for a number of years, and then in 1982, because it had grown in numbers, but not in budget, not in terms of numbers of faculty and so forth, and we were unable to do that. The College of Fine Arts was asked, along with other colleges, to put up, for budget cuts, programs that they did not think were viable. The only program that Dave Schrader, who was dean at the time, could look to see might be expendable, but it didn't really cover the loss of, it didn't cover the money they had to make up. Budget would be the Writers' Workshop. So we were put on the block, as it were. And we went before the regents to defend our program, which was extremely harrowing time. But our students came to our aid. They came to talk about the experience and what it's meant to them to have this program. These are people from the community. Other writers wrote and spoke to it. Our state poet, spoke to it. And then I spoke to it. And I remember at the time they were giving us 3 minutes to defend. And we had all this information to talk about. And the regents sat there and had an egg timer. And they would set it for 3 minutes primarily for each speaker. And I can remember hearing the ticking and watching that thing go while I tried first dispassionately and then with more and more passion to try to encompass everything that this thing meant to not only the campus but to the state of Nebraska and its future. And I saw the news clippings later on that night, and they showed me pointing my finger at the Regents and shaking it like this is diatribe. It ended up being because I had just 3 minutes to talk about this. And I thought, oh, we've lost it. But as it turned out, we did not. We did not lose it. They didn't keep it. And thereafter, then our dean said, okay, that's the last time.
Well, then you grew into a graduate program.
Right. Well, the graduate program's been more recent, and the graduate program, I began work on the proposal for that about 6-7 years ago. It took me 5 years to work the proposal up, to get it through, because the graduate program actually is a joint program of two campuses, ours and the University of Nebraska at Kearney, though UNO is the one that administers it and does all of the our core faculty come from both campuses.
How many faculty do you have now?
Well, we have 18 faculty members. We have 40 students. Now, how do we do that?
Part-time.
Well, we don't call it. They're what we call. This is a low residency MFA program.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that in a minute.
Okay. So, in the low residency model, we're not dependent on full-time faculty in place in residence, working over a period of a semester on classes in writing. Our students come from all over the country, and they arrive and spend 10 days in residence in Nebraska, and those 10 days are filled with lectures, readings, workshops, and individual conferences with people that will mentor them one-on-one for the rest of the semester.
And this is the program that you do down in Nebraska City.
That's correct.
At the
Lead Conference Center down there,
Lodge there,
which is an absolutely wonderful facility. It's the biggest seller for us for when students look to see whether, do I want to go to some campus and stay in a dorm for 10 days, or do I? But yes, we do that at the Lead under a contract with them. We've become one of their biggest customers now down there, because we're twice a year now. We meet
and
for
how
10
long?
days.
10 days.
10 days.
And well, let me ask the question that I started to a minute ago, or said I'd come back to. You're advertised as a low residency program, and indeed this is pointed to often as an advantage of your program.
It is an advantage.
So tell me what, I'd never seen that word before. What's a low residency program?
It is it's a way of describing a combination between distance education and resident education, all right, or face-to-face education. It's the best of both worlds. And what it takes advantage of are people who no longer can afford, for whatever reasons, either career, family, or whatever, to pick up from at home, move to a college campus somewhere, spend 2 years in residence, going through a Master of Fine Arts degree in writing there, and then leaving again to go back to or to try to find some new direction for their lives. That still becomes, those resident programs still become ways, particularly for young students coming right out with bachelor's degrees, but there's a whole body of people out there for whom home-based education makes more sense, and or if they need only spend a short time at a university or at an institution to prep them for that time, and then can go back to their work. So for writers, this makes intense sense to me to operate a program this way, because writers ultimately have to face themselves alone for long periods of time anyway. It's not an ensemble. It's not an ensemble art form. It doesn't require a lot of equipment, and you'd be in a particular place to learn or operate. It requires that you have enough education, enough impetus, enough inspiration to then face yourself alone and do your work alone. So what we do is we bring students and we bring faculty in who teach at other institutions full-time, but come in to teach in our program because they are going to be able to do that back at their own institutions, working one-on-one at a distance with a student they'll be mentoring for a semester, or 3 or 4 students that they can do that with. It's like doing thesis work for with a student over a period of a semester, or an independent study with them. So those faculty we hire who come in to work with us come in on a per student basis. We pay them a certain amount of money per student that they work with, plus pay for their travel and lodging while they're here. Their meals are included in the lodging.
Is that competitive admission then?
Yes.
Sounds very favorable for the students.
Well, it is, and it is. It's as competitive in terms of admission as any MFA program in the country. And Jack, it's an odd sort of phenomenon. People will ask, well, who would want to pay money to go for a master's degree in creative writing? And the answer is, I don't know. The answer is, I don't know, but they're growing in numbers. They're not. We haven't hit the wave of this in the years since 1953, when Paul Engel started his program. I belong to a professional association, the Association of Writing Programs. There are over 400 member institutions, universities and colleges that have writing programs that are a part of this. I just came from one of our regional conventions, actual national convention, but they move it regionally every year, down in Atlanta. There were 5,200 participants, people who had come just to, for 3 full days of workshops, conferences, panels, 5,000 people just attending that one conference this year. That's a horrendous amount, a number of people. All of them involved in one way or another graduate creative writing programs. And there are still more people applying than there is room to fit them or that can work with them on a graduate level.
Well, what do these students typically do when they get their degree? Have you got any success stories to talk about?
We don't yet, because in our MFA we will be graduating our first students this July. We started with 12 students. 12 students 2 years ago, and that first crop, one of them had to drop out for a while. She's now back in and picked up again. So 11 of them have continued through the 2 years. And they will be graduating in their own kind of graduation celebration at the Lead in July, having completed a very rigorous series of writing, reading, critical semesters of work, and then a book-length thesis of work that they'll be judged on. The book-length thesis, presumably chosen or approved on the basis of it being of publishable quality. And so we don't have the success stories yet. But the reason I went and decided, before I leave this institution, having come in and sort of built a BFA program, I thought I would leave it with an MFA program.
Is this unique in this part of the country, or in Nebraska?
It is. There are probably 20 of them now in the country. The oldest being, I think, 25 years old, was the Vermont College, and that began that sort of thing in low residency. We are the first one in a public institution. Most of these have come out of private schools. And we're the first one in the Midwest, and we're the first MFA in writing program in the university system. So we've got kind of 3 firsts in there. And the reason I began that is I had students coming out of our bachelor's program who went on to pursue their graduate work in low residency programs, and what I began to notice was the acceleration of their craft and art over a period of 2 years that these programs provided them, and the intensity of focusing on their writing, the improvement, and then out of that they're getting very good publications, first publications, and so forth. So I said, if we're going to do a program here, that makes the most sense than trying to put one through with the expense of it would take to do a resident graduate program. So, and this is a program that by and large is paid for, by the students' tuition dollars and by fees. There's no state-aided money going into doing this. So they're coming with the idea that they're paying for their own education, and they're coming because they want to know how to write They want to know. We have, I think now, we have 2 medical doctors, we have an attorney, we have a PhD who teaches in social work in Florida. We've got 3 other English teachers in universities who teach literature courses and you know, on there who come. These are all students of ours coming in. The average age probably is high 30s, low 40s as an average. Our lowest ages will be 23 or 4, 22 or 3 coming out of undergraduate, and I think we have a student now who's 63.
This sounds like it must be really fun, not only for the students, but for you.
It's absolutely phenomenal because they arrive together, students and faculty, and it's as if, because they're separated from, you know, everybody else in this really lovely location. You know, it's like, to them it's like coming home from the first time. Even new students and new faculty coming in seem to pull together because they're with each other for 24 hours a day, basically for 10 days.
You know, one thing I've noticed in your background as I've looked at it is that you've, not as a student, but as an artist, have had a number of summer residencies yourself.
Right.
And did the experiences you have had there influence what you were able to develop in the
master's
MFA
level?
program?
They're sort of 2 separate things.
Yeah, I understand
the summer residencies for me were ways of breaking away. By summer residencies, there are a number of quote-unquote artist colonies around the country.
Yeah, I'm familiar with one that you've attended. That's the
Yaddo in New York,
in Saratoga, because I grew up right near there.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
In Schenectady.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great place. And then there's, I mean, there are a number. There's McDowell Colony in New Hampshire, but anyway, these colonies invite in. Well, you have to apply,
right?
And
they're competitive.
And they're competitive, almost like applying to graduate school. So on the basis of the samples of the work and the project you want to work on, they will either accept or reject you to come and spend. And it varies. With me, it was always a month, at least a month at a time, because I would be working on, you know, the beginnings of or the middle of a new book, and that required total concentration and working for me when I do that sort of thing, anywhere from 10 to 12 hours a day on the work, off and on. And the reason for those, and the reason why they became important, because my life here, once you come into the institution, teaching back to the institution, teaching classes, the demands of committees or administrations, they're not conducive to, you know, you're sitting down at regular times and being able to work on a long piece of work. Okay.
But these summer residencies also had people involved who don't they, who would speak or no,
they were total retreats.
Total retreats.
Yeah, it's like going to a monastery. Okay, and having your little cubicle that you lived in and worked in, and you associated with fellow artists maybe over dinner time.
Okay.
You know, at dinner time or another, you know, social hours or so forth. You got to know other people there, but otherwise, no, you were protected. You were protected from outside phone calls. Nobody could get to you, right? And if you wanted to, you know, want to speak to anyone outside, you had to initiate it.
So yeah, those worked well for you.
Oh, they absolutely. And I have recommended them to students, particularly those who have you know, work at other places and so forth.
The 3 that you mentioned, we've mentioned Yaddo already, but Ragdale was.
Ragdale is another, which is in Lake Forest, Illinois.
Near Chicago.
And the other one is the Anderson Center for Interdisciplinary Studies.
In Minnesota, right?
That's in Minnesota, in Red Wing, Minnesota. All of these, each one of these places was built on the estate of somebody who had given the estate over ultimately to the arts to develop people who, once they had no further use, the family, you know, said, here, you know, turn it into an artist colony, I guess.
You know, we've got maybe 10 minutes left or even less. I told you to go fast, but I would like to talk to you, or give you a chance to talk to me, I should say, about your artistic accomplishments. What are you most proud of? I know you've done a lot of short stories. You've done a couple of novels.
I think, there's nothing I'm most proud of. I'm probably most proud of the things that, at this point, that are more recent that haven't been published yet, right? That are more recent ones I've worked on. Most proud of the novel I completed here a year ago that is out in search right now of a home in publishing, which is a novel about young boys in a summer camp in New Hampshire. Actually, it's a novel about how we condition, how we socialize our young people. That grew out of my out of the concern for what we see to be rising crime rates among young people and bullying and all of that sort of thing. And people wondering, why did all this begin? How did it happen? And that got me going on the idea for the novel, which is sort of like I guess it would be the summer camp version of Lord of the Flies. Taking young boys from the age of 12, this particular cabin full of boys, or 11, 12-year-olds, from all parts of the Northeast, and putting them together in this one cabin for a summer and watching what happens and how it steeps. So the book is called Snipe Hunters, and for me, it really works. And if you're familiar with the snipe hunting, which is a way of pulling a practical joke on the newcomer, on the new people. So it's about, in terms of the protagonist who's looking back on this experience from his adult years. It's his way of accomplishing some sort of closure with the idea of a death that took place in that camp at the time he was there. And a sense of betrayal he feels. But that's probably, I mean, in terms of what I'm proud of, it's always the most recent thing. Most recent thing. Overall, I look back and I'm quite satisfied with how my career itself has, that's involved as much the creation and building of 2 programs that have influenced other young people in their lives. I'm as proud of that kind of thing and as satisfied with my contributions to that as I am to my own work. And because, in a sense, I probably would have written more if I hadn't also been involved in this other thing. But being involved in the other thing has been another way for me to express my my creative imagination and drive.
Well, your graduate program is too young to have produced students yet, but your undergraduate program isn't. What of your? Do you have any?
Well, our undergraduate program primarily, besides preparing people to continue writing, giving them the kind of craft, what has happened with the BFA program is it has developed a number of students who have to do a thesis. I mean, not all of them, but have the ability to do a thesis, which becomes their entree to graduate programs if they want to go on.
Have many of them done that?
About half of our students go on to graduate programs, and I am very proud of the fact that of those students who have applied to graduate programs from our program, 100% have been accepted into a graduate program of one of the graduate programs of their choice. That their preparation, what we have been able to do here with the BFA programs, to prepare them in such a way that their transition into graduate level is quite easy. They come back to tell us that they felt so fully prepared that from the beginning they were kind of set apart in their classes as the people to talk to about, in workshops particularly, to lead a discussion of critiques of other students' work.
Have any of them followed your footsteps to Iowa?
Going to Iowa, you mean?
To the Writers' Workshop?
Yeah, several of them. Several of them have, but there are also, any longer of really fine resident MFA programs and low residency programs around the country. So their choices are based on where they feel they're going to fit best.
Now, I understand that this is a creative writing program, but but students learn to write in it, and I imagine some of them learn to use their creativity very well. But do any of them go into commercial work?
Yes. I can't give you numbers at this point, but we have people who have then found employment working on house organs of large corporations, have gone into advertising. One of our students, one of our former students, actually is self-employed, but he started to write, I don't know what you call them, users book for video games. When the video games come out, they come out with their instructions on how to use them, but they'll be followed by books on to help users to crack the game, and they're written like like little stories, novels about the characters in the thing and how you can manipulate. He's made a living, lives in a very fine home in Boulder, Colorado, writing those books. In fact, as he said, I had a bestseller. He said, I wrote the, whatever they call that kind of book, he said, for the game of Myth, which I'm not that familiar with. But he said that sold 500,000 copies.
That's one of the more intellectual games.
He said that sold 500,000 copies. So I'm a bestseller. But that's how he makes his living while he continues to write, short stories and publish them.
You should try Myth sometime, because it
really,
it's not like these games where everybody's shooting guns at each other. It's a very intellectual process to go through.
Oh my goodness!
And it's fun.
What a concept!
It's fun. You can get
not destroying something.
Oh, there's one question I want to ask you, and we only have a couple minutes left. But there's a big change in your college.
Yes. Now we've gone from college.
Does that influence you at all?
Actually, at this point, it doesn't influence me. It's influencing the college and the Writers' Workshop part of it. My function in the Writers' Workshop, I'm on partial retirement. My sole job at this point as a half-time person is to direct the MFA program, to get it up and going. So I'm really out of the classroom and into administration.
Well, the big change is,
and the
of course,
MFA
bringing communication into the college.
That's correct. Which
I see, you're a communicator as a writer.
Right.
So
no, I see it as from the standpoint of my colleagues in the Writers' Workshop, we have seen it from the beginning as a positive. With journalism, being able to make closer communication with journalism, with communication, with... I probably wouldn't have been, I take advantage of radio TV, which is also part of that thing now, to borrow equipment from them, to use in our MFA program when we're in residency and so forth. And it just has facilitated that kind of process, instead of going across campus, across colleges, and trying to work with what used to be what we call the turf wars. This new communication college and our new dean, I think, offer an exciting future, I think.
We've got 1 minute left.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you, we've talked about people. We've talked about Milo Bea, we've talked about Ralph Wardle and others. Is there anybody that you can think of that you'd like to mention in the, right now, 30 seconds that we've got left?
Well, I'll tell you, Jack, there are numbers of them that have been interesting. I was thinking about that question earlier. But to me, I see my experience here as whole cloth, as a single fabric. And when I begin to pick at individuals that have been influential and pull them out, I can't pull them out without unraveling the whole context in which I knew them.
Probably just as well, because our time's up. And thank you very much for coming in, Dick. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today in a visit with Professor Richard Duggin, longtime faculty member at UNO. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UNO as seen through the eyes of those who have made this history. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.